The late autumn light bathed Windmere Lake in gold, wrapping the quiet town in a sense of peace that seemed unshakable. On the porch of a modest wooden house, a German shepherd named Rocco lay watchful, his amber eyes following the laughter of little Leah as she played under the maple trees. To the townsfolk, Rocco was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a friend, a silent promise of safety. But when a long-absent family member appeared without warning, the wind carried more than the scent of autumn leaves. It carried the first signs of a storm Rocco would be forced to face. The late autumn breeze drifted gently across Windmere Lake, tracing ripples that caught the golden honey light of the late afternoon. On the water, a few wooden fishing boats floated lazily, their oars dipping softly to stir the lake in a rhythm as steady as the town's slow heartbeat. Along the shore, rows of maple trees had turned deep crimson and fiery orange, their leaves spiraling to the ground, laying a soft, thin carpet over the winding path. The air carried a crisp chill laced with the earthy scent of damp soil and the faint smoke of kitchen fires rising from scattered wooden houses around the lake. Windmere was the kind of place where time seemed to slow. In the mornings, the bell of the small church on the square rang long and clear, announcing a new day. By noon, the shops along the main street opened, sending out the warm scent of baked goods, coffee, and pine wood, mingling with the easy chatter of familiar neighbors. And when the evening settled in, the roofs glowed under the golden light as if the whole town were wrapped in a soft, comforting blanket. Mason's home sat on a gentle slope facing the lake. A two-story wooden house with slanted eaves and beige-painted walls, its porch adorned with a basket of golden daisies. Mason, a man in his 30s, and once the town's carpenter, had hands worn and strong and eyes that carried a quiet calm. He lived with his wife Sarah, the local elementary school teacher, and their 4-year-old daughter Leah, whose smile was as bright as morning sunlight. They weren't wealthy, but their evenings were always filled with the warmth of the fireplace and the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the rooms. And with them there was always a large, noble, yet gentle shadow. Rocco, the German shepherd Mason had raised since he was 2 months old. His coat, a rich amber brushed with sable, glowed in sunlight. His ears stood tall, and his deep brown eyes held both alertness and kindness. Everyone in town knew Rocco, not just for his striking looks, but for his calm intelligence and his unwavering bond with Leah. From the moment Leah took her first wobbly steps, Rocco had been her silent guardian. Each morning when Mason opened the porch door to greet the sun, Rocco would already be waiting, ready to walk alongside Leah as she picked wildflowers in the yard. When she built towers from wooden blocks or scribbled drawings, Rocco would lie close by his head, resting lightly on her small legs, occasionally glancing at the window out of instinctive watchfulness. Even in the heavy heat of summer afternoons, when everything seemed to doze, Rocco kept his ears tilted for the faintest unfamiliar sound. Mason often told friends that Rocco was not just a guard dog. He was family. He believed the dog understood each person's emotions in a way words could not explain. When Sarah came home weary after a long day, Rocco would press his head gently into her hand. When Mason worked late in the shed, Rocco would wait patiently on the porch, eyes fixed on the dirt road that led home. And to Leah, Rocco was her whole world. She would wrap her arms around his neck, whispering her little secrets. And Rocco would simply listen, as if he understood every word. Late autumn was Mason's favorite time in Windmere. He often took the family to the lake shore, laying out a plaid blanket, bringing a thermos of hot tea and a few of Sarah's freshly baked pastries. Leah would run about, gathering fallen maple leaves, and Rocco would stay close, stopping now and then to breathe in the scent of the wind. The golden light of the sun would catch in Rocco's eyes, setting his amber coat ablaze as though dyed by the sunset itself. That day was no different. After lunch, Mason decided they should go to the lake. The sky was a bright, unbroken blue clouds, drifting slowly as though lost in thought. Leah wore a red sweater with snowflake patterns, clutching a little basket to collect her treasures. the most beautiful leaves she could find. Rocco walked to her left, Mason to her right, while Sarah followed a few steps behind, smiling softly at the sight of her daughter flanked by her two loyal companions. Along the way they passed neighbors hauling firewood, elderly folk knitting scarves on their porches, and children laughing as they chased each other beneath the maples. Everyone greeted Mason, and no one forgot to reach down to pat Rocco, the town's beloved German shepherd. The closeness of it all seeped into every step they took. When they reached the shore, the lake mirrored the afternoon light, sending gentle waves outward. Mason spread the blanket, Sarah poured the tea, and Leah sat beside Rocco, her tiny hands stroking his smooth, warm fur. The scent of tea drifted in the breeze, mingling with the cool freshness of wild grass and lake water. In that moment, everything felt perfect, as if time itself had paused to preserve this warm family picture beneath autumn's glow. Mason couldn't have known that in just a few days, this very place would be where everything began to change, and Rocco would become the heart of a story the whole town would remember. That evening, as the last golden rays slanted over the lake, Mason was in his woodworking shed behind the house, polishing the surface of a newly finished table. The steady hum of the planer blended with the rustle of leaves outside a melody he knew by heart. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, while Leah and Rocco played on the porch, her laughter spilling into the peaceful air. The rumble of an old truck stopping at the top of the dirt road made Rocco's ears snap upright. He stopped playing, eyes fixed in the direction of the sound, his body leaning forward slightly, as if measuring what was coming. Mason glanced toward the window of his shed. A tall, lean figure stepped out of the truck, wearing a dark coat, his stride slow but certain. As the man drew closer, Mason froze. He recognized him instantly. Evan, his half-brother, the one he hadn't seen in years. The autumn wind swept through the yard, carrying with it a scent Mason thought belonged to the past. The wooden gate creaked open. Hearing the sound, Sarah stepped onto the porch. She paused when she saw the man, then smiled politely, though her eyes couldn't hide the surprise. Leah, who had never met him, took a curious step forward, while Rocco stood still, his gaze locked on the visitor. Mason. "It's been a long time," Evan said with a smile that carried echoes of childhood days spent playing beneath the lakeside trees, but also unspoken things neither had voiced. "I'm here for a while," Evan added. "I've missed everyone." Sarah invited him in, setting out another cup. In the living room, the firelight touched the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. He spoke briefly of his years away, the places he had seen, the unstable jobs, the constant travel. His voice was low and steady, though sometimes he paused as if searching for the right words. Mason listened, but his eyes would drift to Rocco. The dog hadn't settled by the fire, as he usually did when guests came. Instead, he stood beside Leah, his body angled forward, amber fur along his shoulders, faintly raised ears tracking Evan's every move. Sarah noticed too and rested her hand lightly on Rocco's back, as if to reassure him. Dinner that evening came together quickly. Sarah laid out roasted meat and a fragrant pumpkin soup, the warmth of the dishes filling the small dining room. The family gathered around the table, conversation mingling with the soft clink of cutlery against plates. Leah chattered to Uncle Evan about her school, her friends, her eyes lighting up as she spoke of the upcoming autumn festival. Evan listened, nodding occasionally, smiling. But every so often his gaze drifted away into brief unspoken silences. Beneath the table, Rocco lay stretched out, but instead of his usual easy rest, his body was angled, head lifted, eyes fixed on the guest. Mason noticed that whenever Evan leaned closer to Leah, Rocco would subtly shift his position, placing himself between the little girl and the uncle she had just met. It was a discreet gesture, but to Mason, who knew every habit of his dog, it was a clear sign of caution. After dinner, while Sarah cleared the dishes, Mason poured fresh hot tea for Evan. "How long will you be staying?" Mason asked, his tone light, but his eyes measuring. Maybe a week, maybe more, Evan replied, his voice dipping slightly at the end. I just wanted to find a bit of peace here in Windmere. Outside, the wind picked up dry leaves swirling across the yard. Rocco stood in the doorway, staring down the dark road that led toward town. Something in that steady gaze sent a faint chill down Mason's spine, as if the dog sensed something beyond the reach of human eyes. Leah came running, wrapping her arms around Rocco's neck, her laughter scattering the thin tension between the two brothers. Mason stood watching his daughter and the dog, then glanced at Evan, the man he had once trusted without question as a child. He said nothing, but inside a spark of doubt had been lit. Evan excused himself to the porch for a cigarette. From the kitchen window, Mason saw him leaning on the railing, the small glow of the cigarette flaring in the dark. Rocco stayed with Leah, but every so often turned his head toward the porch, his brown eyes glinting in the dim light. When Evan came back inside, he spoke a little more, then excused himself early, claiming fatigue from the long trip. Sarah prepared the upstairs guest room, smoothing fresh sheets and setting out extra blankets. Mason led his brother up the hall, the golden lamplight stretching along the wooden corridor. Before closing the door, Mason heard the quiet sound of Rocco moving at the foot of the stairs, as though settling into a watch post. Evan glanced down at him with a smile, but Rocco stood still, head tilted, eyes never wavering. Back in the living room, Sarah poured more tea. Mason sat beside her, listening to Leah's soft singing upstairs. Outside, Windmere Lake reflected the pale curve of a new moon, the night air carrying the damp scent of earth and wood. The peace was complete, yet Mason could feel the faint ripple of unease. Something born both from words unspoken and from the way Rocco watched Evan. Night had fallen fully over Windmere. The lake lay beneath a thin veil of mist, its surface catching the moonlight like a silvered mirror breathing autumn's chill. Inside, the fireplace popped and cracked heat spilling through the living room. Leah sat on the wool rug, surrounding herself with a small kingdom of dolls, wooden cars, and bright marbles. She was lost in her world of make-believe. Rocco lay beside her, his long frame curved to match the rug's edge, amber and sable fur glowing in the firelight. Yet, unlike his usual relaxed posture, there was a slight tension in his body. His eyes locked on Evan, seated across in the armchair, a steaming cup of Sarah's tea in hand. Now and then, Rocco's tail thumped the floor mechanically when Leah patted his back, but his ears stayed pricked, tracking the guest's every move. Evan seemed to notice, but simply smiled, set down his cup and leaned toward Leah. "What are you building there, princess?" he asked softly, just loud enough to rise above the crackle of the fire. "A castle for Rocco," Leah replied without hesitation, her eyes bright. "He'll be the king, and I'll be the princess." Evan chuckled, something flickering in his eyes, something hard to name. Before he reached for a marble, rolling it between his fingers, Rocco's gaze followed the movement instantly, head lowering, his dark eyes sharpening as if memorizing it. Sarah emerged from the kitchen with a tray of freshly baked cookies, the warm scent of butter and cinnamon spreading through the room. Evan took one, speaking with fresh enthusiasm about his travels. Coastal cities, nights on ship decks, friends met and lost again. His voice was even and low. But Mason, perched on the edge of his seat near the fire, caught the unnatural pauses, as though parts of the story were being left out. Rocco rose to sit upright, his gaze shifting between Evan and Leah. Each time Evan leaned slightly toward the little girl, the dog's focus intensified. Mason recognized that look. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment, the kind a guardian makes when weighing a potential threat. The evening went on quieter than usual. Leah kept playing blissfully unaware. Sarah and Evan talked about old friends in town, the changes of recent years. Evan listened intently, sometimes asking questions, sometimes glancing out the window toward the road, vanishing into the night. After a while, Evan stood and said he wanted some fresh air on the porch. Mason nodded his eyes, meeting Rocco's. The German shepherd slipped from the rug, following at a measured pace, stopping in the doorway. Evan leaned on the railing, the light from inside catching only half his face. From his place inside, Mason saw Rocco standing still, head lowered slightly, watching him, like a sentry awaiting a signal. When Evan returned to the living room, Rocco followed close behind, keeping just enough distance to remain in control. Leah giggled, pulling the dog back toward her dolls, but Mason knew Rocco's mind was elsewhere. Sarah tidied the kitchen, and Mason took Leah upstairs to bed. Rocco came too, waiting at her doorway until she was tucked in, then returning downstairs to sit at the base of the staircase as if awaiting orders. Evan had gone to his room, but Mason lingered in the living room, turning pages of a newspaper he wasn't reading, ears tuned to every sound. The wind rattled the doorframe, leaves whispered against the porch. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked now and then. Whether from footsteps or the old house shifting in the cold, it was impossible to say. Rocco stayed at his post, head angled toward the stairs, blinking slowly. Now and then he glanced at Mason, as if trying to speak without words. Mason stepped over, resting his hand on the warm fur of the dog's head. That familiar heat brought a strange comfort, but also raised the question he could not yet answer. Why would Rocco, a dog who welcomed everyone, hold himself so firmly on guard with Evan? Beyond the window, the town of Windmere seemed to be sleeping. But Mason knew his brother's sudden return was not just a casual visit, and Rocco's eyes, steady, watchful, unwavering, were a silent reminder that he needed to be ready for whatever was coming. The aroma of beef stew and freshly baked bread drifted through the kitchen, mingling with the warmth from the fireplace, until it felt as if nothing could stand between them. Sarah moved from counter to table, her hands deftly arranging plates. Green salad glistening with olive oil, bowls of velvety pumpkin soup steaming in the golden light. Mason sliced the bread, setting a piece beside each plate, while Leah pulled out the small chair for Rocco in his usual corner, where his food bowl always waited. Evan entered from the living room, his coat now hanging on the rack, wearing only a dark shirt with the collar open slightly. Taking his seat, he smiled faintly. "Your stew still smells as good as ever, Sarah." His tone was warm, but Mason sensed something else beneath it. A quiet weight, a trace of study in every word. Dinner began. Leah bubbled with stories about her school play, her new friend Ellie, the dress she would wear to the autumn festival. Evan listened closely, asking just enough questions to make her giggle. Sarah watched with a soft smile, as though the years of distance between Mason and Evan had faded into something harmless. But Rocco was different. His bowl full and ready remained untouched. Instead of eating, he lay on his side, head turned toward the dark hallway beyond the kitchen. His ears stood tall, eyes fixed on the shadows where the light didn't reach. He barely flicked an ear at the sound of the spoon against his bowl, not even glancing at the table. Mason noticed. He knew Rocco's habits. When beef stew was on the menu, the dog was always first to the bowl, eating heartily before settling into the floor. But tonight, everything was different. That gaze, steady and locked on the dark, was unshakable, and it made Mason's skin prickle. "What's out there, buddy?" Mason murmured almost to himself. Evan looked over, brows lifting. "Rocco's been on edge since this afternoon." "Strange." Sarah stepped in, her voice gentle as though to lighten the moment. "Maybe it's just a mouse or a stray cat. They look for warmth this time of year." But Mason wasn't convinced. He knew Rocco could tell the difference between a wandering cat and something else entirely. Outside, the wind began to howl. The glass panes rattled with each gust, and the sound threaded through the room like an unreadable whisper. In the quiet between conversations, Mason caught something else. A sound so faint, it might have been imagined like footsteps gliding over distant wooden boards. He looked up, but Evan was busy slicing bread. Sarah pouring more soup for Leah. "Mason, you remember when we went fishing at the North Dock?" Evan asked, suddenly his gaze steady. Mason nodded, the image rising unbidden. A cold morning long ago, two brothers standing shoulder to shoulder on wet planks, laughing as they hauled in their first fish. I remember. We promised we'd go back, Evan said, smiling faintly. Yet his eyes darkened a shade. Maybe this time we should. Sarah glanced between them, but stayed silent. The meal went on, yet Mason felt these recollections were not simple nostalgia. They felt like deliberate steps towards something he couldn't yet see. Rocco rose, patting a few deliberate steps toward the hallway. His body lowered slightly, every movement precise, as though tracking a scent. Mason followed the motion with his eyes, but didn't interrupt Leah's story. The dog stopped, stood still for several seconds, then returned. But the wariness in his gaze never softened. Dessert came, warm apple pie dusted with cinnamon. Leah squealed with delight. Evan praised the taste, yet Rocco stayed in his post near the hallway. Outside, the darkness felt dense, the only sounds the wind's whistle and the occasional tap of a branch against the window. When the plates were cleared, Sarah ushered Leah upstairs for bed. Evan helped Mason tidy the table, though his gaze strayed toward the hallway every now and then, where Rocco still stood like a sentry. Later, Mason stepped onto the porch. The wind hit his face, carrying the damp scent of fallen leaves and lake water. He stared down the road to town, its dim streetlight casting a broken glow through the trees. Something in the air pressed heavy against his chest, an unease like something was lingering just beyond the reach of the light. Back inside, Rocco lay down, but kept his eyes open, fixed on the hallway's dark mouth. Evan sat in the armchair, silent, rolling an empty teacup between his hands, his unreadable gaze catching the flicker of the fire. Beyond the walls, the wind carried on, a low, constant reminder that Windmere's peace might be only borrowed. And Mason knew from both the signals in Rocco's behavior and the way Evan's eyes sometimes drifted away that the warmth in this house could soon be broken. Upstairs, the hallway glowed in the soft amber of a single wall sconce. Outside, the wind still rasped against the windows at times, making a sound long and cold, like a voice calling faintly in the night. Leah, fresh from brushing her teeth, hugged her stuffed bear and padded toward her room, her small footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. From the staircase, Evan began to climb, slow, steady steps, each creak of the wood folding into the wind's voice. As Leah reached the dimmer stretch of hallway where the light failed to reach, Evan stopped. His gaze followed the small figure ahead. "Leah, can I see your teddy bear?" he asked. His voice was low, almost as if he meant it to ride along with the wind, but it carried just enough for her to hear. She paused, turning back her child's eyes, still full of trust. But before she could take a step toward him, the air snapped. From the base of the stairs, Rocco launched upward in a burst of power. His amber and sable coat bristled, his body taut as a drawn bow. The growl that broke from his chest rolled through the narrow hall like thunder against wooden walls. In a heartbeat, he stood between Leah and Evan. 4 paws rooted, head lowered, brown eyes like molten steel locked on the man. Leah froze her eyes wide, then instinctively stepped back. The bear slipped from her hands, rolling onto the carpet. The air seemed to harden. Nothing moved but the wind at the eaves and Rocco's steady, rapid breathing. Evan halted, hands lifting slightly as if to calm the room. "Easy. Easy now." He murmured, his tone soft, but his eyes glinting with something Mason had only seen in people caught on the edge of being found out. Footsteps came from the far end of the hall. Mason. He wore a light sweater, a book still in one hand, but his eyes swept instantly over the scene. On one side stood Evan, leaning slightly toward Leah. On the other was Rocco, a living wall blocking any line between the man and the child. "What's going on here?" Mason's voice was low, firm. Evan smiled faintly, aiming for ease. "What do you think? I just wanted to ask Leah about her teddy bear." Rocco must have misunderstood. Rocco didn't take his eyes off Evan, his breathing still, quick ears locked forward. Mason stepped closer, resting a hand on the dog's head. Beneath his palm, the muscles were tight, coiled like wire. That told him more than any explanation could. "Take Leah to her room." Mason set his gaze, never leaving Evan. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, startled at the scene before her. She gently took Leah's hand, guiding her toward her room and closing the wooden door behind them. Their silhouettes disappeared, leaving 3 figures in the hallway. A man, a dog, and a silence wound, as tight as a drawn bowstring. Evan shrugged, taking a step back toward the stairs. "What's with the drama, Mason? I came back to visit family." "Family?" Mason repeated, his voice low, glancing down at Rocco. And Rocco has never been wrong about who's worth protecting. For a moment, something in Evan's eyes shifted. A cold flicker passing through before he turned away and descended the stairs. His footsteps echoed in the quiet, mingling with the wind at the windows, like a promise of something unfinished. Rocco remained where he was until Mason gave a light pat on his shoulder. Only then did the dog ease slightly, though his eyes stayed trained on the floor below. Mason knew this wasn't just instinct. It was confirmation. Whatever Evan's return meant, it came with danger, and Rocco had just made the strongest statement a loyal creature could. The hallway dimmed as the wall light flickered, letting in a thread of chill through the seams in the wood. Mason understood. This was only the beginning of a confrontation he and Rocco would have to face together. The living room glowed under the flicker of the fire. But the warmth was laced with an undercurrent of tension, as if cold air were seeping in through an unseen gap. Mason stood near the door, arms folded, his gaze cutting straight through his younger brother. Evan sat slouched in the armchair, spinning a half-empty glass in one hand, tracing the rim with the other, avoiding direct eye contact. "I want the real reason you came back." Mason began, his tone not loud, but weighted enough to demand an answer. Evan gave a faint, awkward smile, then sighed. "You've always doubted me. Rocco doesn't react like that to harmless people." Mason cut in, voice slow and firm. "Tonight in the hallway, what were you doing with Leah?" Evan stayed still for a long moment, eyes fixed on the leaping flames. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "All right, you want the truth?" His voice had dropped to a rough edge. "I owe money, a lot, to people you don't want to know. The kind who don't take no for an answer." Mason's face didn't change, but inside the words settled like ice. "How much enough?" "That if I don't pay, they'll come here," Evan said, skirting the number, his eyes twitching with unease. "I need time. And somewhere safe." Sarah, standing in the kitchen doorway, instinctively brought her hand to her mouth. She stepped in, sitting beside Mason. "Evan, how bad is this?" she asked, her voice tight. "They're not the kind to let things go," he said, glancing between them, searching for understanding. "But don't worry. I'll figure it out." "Figure it out? How and why were you talking to Leah in the hallway?" Mason pressed. Evan sat up straighter, answering quickly. "I just wanted to talk. I swear." But the gap in his reply was obvious, as if something was still being left unsaid. The wind outside lashed at the windows, its whistle long and sharp. Rocco, still stationed at the living room entrance, kept his eyes on Leah, now curled on the sofa with her teddy bear. The firelight caught in his amber coat ears, pricked, tracking her every movement. Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "If those people come here..." What then? Mason didn't answer right away. He knew the type Evan had described, and once they knew where to find someone, there was no such thing as peace. Evan rose, moving to the window, staring out into the dark. "I just need a few days. Then I'll go. I promise." Mason watched him, the thin thread of trust fraying even further. But blood had its own weight, and that made every choice heavier. Sarah placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, a silent reminder that whatever they decided now would shape what came next. Rocco remained rooted in place, his body taut eyes unwavering, ready for whatever might come. The fire popped and crackled, casting their faces in warm light. But Mason could feel the darkness pressing in, not just from outside, but from whatever truth Evan was still holding back. And he knew the worst was yet to come. Morning light spilled through the last veil of autumn mist, turning the surface of Windmere Lake a pale, gentle gold. In the kitchen, the faint aroma of freshly ground coffee drifted in the air as Sarah prepared breakfast. Mason sat at the table, newspaper open, but unread, his thoughts still caught in the half-truths from the night before. Evan appeared in the doorway, his hair damp from washing a phone in his hand. His eyes darted briefly around before slipping it into his pocket. Mason caught the movement, quick, deliberate, almost too casual. When Evan stepped out to the porch for a cigarette, a faint vibration came from the coat draped over a chair. Mason recognized it instantly as Evan's phone. Through the window, he could see his brother's back turned, smoke curling into the cold air. The vibration came again, longer this time. He hesitated, then reached into the coat and pulled the phone free. The screen lit up with a string of unread messages from an unknown number. The words were short, stripped of any emotion, but sharp with threat. Time's running out. Don't make us come there. Tonight, back door. Mason's chest tightened. The words back door hit hard, linking instantly to the image of last night's hallway. He gripped the phone, his eyes lifting toward Evan, still standing motionless outside. A sudden bark shattered the stillness. From the living room, Rocco, who had been lying watch while Leah played with her blocks, sprang to his feet, the fur along his spine bristling. His ears locked toward the window, gaze sharpened. Then Mason heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel outside. A black car had rolled slowly into the drive, pausing for several seconds as though to take measure of the house. Rocco moved quickly to the door, planting himself squarely in front of it, his body charged with energy. A deep, low growl rumbled from his throat. Not loud, but carrying the kind of warning anyone would understand instantly. Outside, the car in the driveway rolled back, turned, and disappeared down the dirt road. Evan came back in, pretending not to notice, but Mason caught the fleeting tension in his eyes. "Friends of yours?" Mason asked, his voice soft but cold. Evan shrugged, pouring more coffee. "Probably just lost." Mason didn't respond, slipping Evan's phone back into his coat pocket, exactly where it had been. He knew if he pressed now, his brother would only circle the truth. But the messages had already said more than any confession could. All morning, Rocco shadowed Leah's every step. When she went into the kitchen, he sat in the doorway. When she stepped out to the porch, he stood between her and the front yard. Every time the sound of an engine drifted from afar, Rocco's ears flicked toward it, his muscles tensing as if ready to spring. By afternoon, the wind off the lake had grown stronger. Mason stood at his study window, eyes on the road leading to the house. In his mind, the question of who was behind those messages had never been sharper. He knew Rocco sensed it too, not in words, but in that invisible language forged through years of shared loyalty. Leah's laughter rang from the living room, followed by the quick click of Rocco's claws across the wood floor. Mason let the curtain fall closed. The unease still clung, as though the entire house was within someone's sights. And he understood. Those calls were only the beginning. Evening descended on Windmere beneath a thin veil of fog, drifting from the lake into Mason's yard. Warm lamplight from the living room spilled across the wooden walls, but the air inside felt heavy. Sarah put Leah to bed earlier than usual, while Mason sat across from Evan at the tea table, the silence between them stretched like an unfinished note. Evan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. His eyes wandered, down to the floor, then out the window, where Rocco lay, with his head resting on his paws, eyes still open, following every movement in the room. I want to know why you really disappeared all those years. Mason said, his voice slow, edged with steel. Evan drew a deep breath, as if mustering the will to speak. It's not that I never wanted to tell you. It's just that things got too messy. He leaned back, the story coming in fragments, breaking like waves against the shore. After leaving Windmere, Evan got involved with a smuggling crew. At first it was small runs, easy money. But then he was pulled into something larger, a shipment of high-value goods tied to men he never imagined meeting. That job. It went bad from the start, Evan said, his voice sinking lower. The shipment vanished in transit, and they pinned the entire loss on us. From then on, I was in debt. A debt I couldn't pay, not even if I sold everything. Mason said nothing, his eyes fixed on his brother. There were still dark gaps in Evan's story, but enough detail to see the danger. This crew, are they working anywhere near Windmere? He asked. Evan hesitated. You know the old warehouse by the east shore? Mason nodded. They've been using it as a staging point. After the crackdown in the city, they've scattered to quieter places. Windmere is quiet, and people don't ask questions. The words sliced through the illusion of peace the town had always worn. Mason's eyes flicked toward the window. The darkness outside seemed deeper now, and the lake's silver reflection felt colder, as if it held something beneath its surface. Why did you come back here? Mason asked. Evan exhaled, his hands tightening. I thought if I was near family, they'd hold off. Or at least, I'd have time to figure something out. Mason leaned back, caught between anger and a grim sense of duty. Evan was bringing danger right to their doorstep, and Mason knew men like that would use any means to get what they wanted. Rocco lifted his head, ears turning toward the porch. He listened for a moment, then lay back down, but Mason recognized the look. An instinctive alertness, like a living radar, tuned to every disturbance. Evan fell silent, as if the rest of the story was too heavy to voice. But Mason understood. Evan's past was now braided into their present, and unless it was cut loose, it would drag them all down. He looked at Rocco, still steady, still watching, then toward the stairs that led to Leah's room. A resolve was taking root inside him. He would learn everything about this crew before they ever came near his family. Outside, the night fog thickened, wrapping the lake in a shroud that hid more than it revealed. Morning in Windmere still wore its familiar calm, but inside Mason's house, the air was different. Pale autumn sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, but no one seemed to take comfort in it. Sarah was pouring coffee when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number glowed on the screen. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, low, gravelly, came through at once with no greeting, no preamble. Keep the girl where you can see her. If you want things to stay quiet, don't think about telling anyone. Sarah's heart clenched. Before she could speak, the line went dead, leaving only the hollow drone of the disconnect. The hot coffee trembled in her hand. Mason, sitting at the table, caught the change in her face instantly. He stood and crossed to her, a light but urgent grip on her arm. Who was it? Sarah drew a deep breath, her voice trying for calm but still trembling. They mentioned Leah. Mason's gaze hardened. He looked toward the living room, where Rocco sat beside Leah, and gave the dog a silent nod. Rocco rose, moving to the porch with a deliberate, solid stride, ears erect. When Mason opened the front door to follow the early light, revealed something unusual in the damp soil still wet with morning dew. A line of footprints stretched from the fence to the bottom of the porch steps. The tread was heavy, not matching any shoes from the house. Mason crouched, pressing his hand to one, feeling the earth still soft. Whoever had been here, it wasn't long ago. Rocco lowered his nose to the ground, sniffing each print with care. His amber and sable fur rippled with each deep breath. When he lifted his head, his eyes sharpened, fixing on the tree line down the road where the fog still clung thick. A short, low growl rolled from his chest, brief but carrying a clear warning. Mason followed his gaze but saw only shifting wisps of mist among the trunks. He turned back to Sarah, his voice flat, certain. "They're watching us." All morning, Mason and Sarah silently split the task of keeping Leah within sight, never letting her stray beyond arm's reach. Evan said little, but Mason noticed him glancing toward the tree line more than once. The tension stretched like a wire between them, vibrating at every sound that drifted in from the yard. Rocco made his own circuit of the property, moving deliberately, pausing at the fence line to sniff and mark. Each step he took seemed to draw an invisible perimeter around the family, an unspoken vow of protection. At lunch, Sarah placed a bowl of soup in front of Leah, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The words from the morning call, "Keep the girl in sight," echoed in her mind like a cold pin pressed into every thought. Mason knew they couldn't just keep waiting. The footprints in the yard and the anonymous call were proof enough whoever was out there had moved closer. Resting his hand along Rocco's back, he murmured, "We'll be ready." Outside, the sun had risen high, but mist still clung to the lake shore as if concealing something beneath its veil. Mason could feel it. The pressure was only starting to mount. That afternoon, while Sarah took Leah into the backyard to play with Rocco, Mason returned to the garage to fix the sticking porch door. In a corner behind stacks of dusty cartons and old boxes, he spotted a gray canvas bag shoved deep onto a low shelf. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but when he pulled it free, the rustle of papers stopped him cold. Inside was a slim file, several thick envelopes, and a worn notebook. Flipping through, Mason found page after page of numbers, symbols, and hurried scrawls. Near the end, a page carried a heading in red ink, "Transaction, November." Beneath it, a note read, "The girl, safe leverage." Mason's pulse hammered. Reading closer, he saw a list of amounts, deadlines, and demands, all tied to a special item. Piecing it together with the threats and the footprints, he understood instantly the girl was Leah. Clutching the papers, Mason strode into the house to find Evan standing at the living room window, eyes fixed on Leah and Rocco playing outside. Mason dropped the file onto the table, his voice low and hard. "Explain." Evan glanced down, then up again, his gaze flickering between confusion and a dull fear. Shoulders sagging, he exhaled. "So, you found it." Mason didn't look away. Evan sat, fingers locking together as if to contain the chaos inside. "They gave me a month to pay. It's too much. When I said I couldn't make it, they offered a solution." He stopped, voice rougher now. "They wanted me to take Leah. Said they'd only keep her a few days to force you to pay for me. If I did it, they'd wipe my debt and let me walk." Heat flared at Mason's temples. He stepped forward, his stare hard. "And you were going to do it at first?" "I thought about it," Evan admitted, lowering his head. "But when I got here, when I saw her, saw Rocco never leaving her side, I couldn't." The confession pressed a heavy silence into the room. Leah's laughter drifted in from the yard, a fragile thread keeping the house from tipping into darkness. "They know this house," Evan continued quietly. "They know your routines. They've been watching since before I came back." Mason ran a hand over his forehead, forcing himself to think. The danger was no longer a shadow. It had form, teeth, and intent. Evan met his eyes, guilt threaded with something harder now. "I'll help you. I know how to get close to them. But we have to prepare. Through the window, Rocco loped in a wide arc around Leah, tail wagging lightly, but eyes scanning the tree line. The late sunlight cast his shadow long over the grass, a living boundary. If they want to play this game, Mason said, they'll have to face all of us. The lake was already deepening to the purple of dusk, and in Mason's chest, a plan to protect Leah and turn the tables was taking shape. The next afternoon, the sky over Windmere turned to dull slate early. Heavy clouds hung low like slabs of stone, and the wind from the lake carried a raw chill. Mason stood on the porch steps, eyes lifted to the shrouded sky, a tightening in his gut, telling him something was coming. The first crack of thunder rolled like a warning. Minutes later, the rain began. Soft at first, tapping on the tin roof, then swelling into a sheet of white that swallowed the street. Water lashed against the windows, running down in long, unreadable streaks. The living room light flickered twice, then died. A dense dark closed in. Sarah lit the candles she'd kept ready from the week before, their faint yellow glow dancing over her face, but unable to chase away the rising tension. Mason signaled to Evan to secure the windows, check the back door lock, and pull the heavy curtains. He'd already stacked wooden boards against the wall in case they needed to barricade. Sarah took Leah upstairs, settling her at a small table with her teddy bear, her comfort in any storm. Outside, Rocco began his patrol. He moved slowly around the porch, ears high, rain clinging to his amber and sable coat, sliding down in narrow rivulets. His gaze swept the yard, pausing longer on the north fence, where days earlier Mason had found strange footprints. A sudden sound from the backyard, a sharp thud on the porch roof. Rocco wheeled toward it, Mason close behind with a flashlight. The beam caught only a broken branch from the old maple. Still beneath the rain's roar, Mason felt the weight of unnatural pauses, like the storm itself was hiding something. The wind rose, slamming the walls with a chorus of rattles and knocks. Every gust sent the window frames trembling. Evan emerged from the garage with a box, flashlights, multi-tools, and coils of rope. "If they come tonight," he said, voice low and steady, "we won't be caught off guard." Sarah came downstairs with a stack of thick blankets, setting them near the fireplace in case the outage stretched on. Mason looked around the room. The house no longer felt like a home. It was a small fortress now, each of them holding a place in its defense. Rocco returned from the backyard, rainwater streaming down his fur in rivulets that dripped onto the wooden floor, yet he didn't pause to rest. After a quick shake, he moved to the front door and stood still, eyes locked on the rain-blurred road beyond. Each time lightning split the sky, his shadow flashed across the wall like a living statue, a figure of steadfastness in the heart of the storm. The sky rumbled with rolling thunder. Mason knew this storm would last, but what troubled him more was the gnawing sense that someone might be using the darkness and rain as cover to approach. He glanced at Evan, then at Sarah. No one spoke, but they all understood. Tonight would be a long night. And in the flickering candlelight, Rocco stood like a lone watchtower against the tempest. The rain pounded the roof like thousands of hands drumming in unison, forming a wall of sound that could hide any smaller noise. But Rocco's ears filtered out the difference. Amid the steady rush of rain, they suddenly twitched upright, his body tightened, eyes shifting toward the house's side door. Mason was checking the front locks when he heard the low growl rumble in Rocco's throat. He looked up sharply. In the instant, a lightning bolt tore through the clouds. Rocco's eyes gleamed, reflecting the flash, locked on a single point beyond the side yard. No words were needed. Mason crossed to Rocco's side, switched off his flashlight to avoid drawing attention, and peered through a narrow gap in the curtain. In the thick downpour, two blurred figures moved low along the fence line, bodies crouched like hunters. Every step they took was deliberate, and even through the rain, Mason caught the brief glint of metal in one man's hand. He pulled out his phone and sent Evan a quick text, "Lock everything." "They're at the side." Less than 10 seconds later, a loud click came from the front door. Evan had secured it. Upstairs, Sarah ushered Leah into the inner bedroom and slid the bolt home. Rocco stayed planted before the side door, a wall of muscle and instinct. The fur along his shoulders stood on end, his breathing slow but heavy. Mason knew. One wrong move from outside and Rocco would strike. One shadow drew closer, gripping the door handle and twisting. The metal clinked, but the lock held firm. The figure turned to his partner, speaking words swallowed by the storm, then tried again, harder this time, shaking the frame. Mason signaled Rocco to step back a pace, keeping room for reaction. Pressing his ear to the wall, he caught the harsh, quick breaths of one of them. In the dark, every sense was sharper. The drip of water from the eaves, the sweep of wind through a crack. The second man left his post, slipping toward the back of the house. From the front, Evan caught a glimpse of him crossing the porch and gave a short whistle, a signal to Mason. Rocco instantly pivoted, trotting the hall that connected the two doors, controlling both fronts like a soldier guarding two gates. Then the rain's roar was pierced by a sharp crash in the backyard, something heavy hitting the ground. Mason knew it was a diversion. He gripped the side door latch, ready to shove back if they tried to force it. Another flash of lightning lit the yard, this time revealing the cold, measured face of a man standing just beyond the eaves. His eyes swept the window, measuring distance. Rocco's growl rolled low and steady, briefly drowning the rain. His gaze never wavered, cutting through water and darkness. One step closer, and you'll regret it. The moment stretched like hours, though it lasted only minutes. Then suddenly both shadows withdrew, swallowed by the storm. The side yard was empty again. But Mason didn't relax. This was only a probe, a test. He turned to Evan. "Tonight isn't over. Keep everything locked. And Rocco." Mason looked down at the dog, still fixed on the yard, as if reading the wind. "Stay on watch." The rain continued to hammer the roof, but inside they were braced for worse. The storm's percussion drummed on the tin roof without pause. The house glowed weakly under candlelight, each flame shivering like it shared the tension of its keepers. Rocco stood at the side door, unmoving, staring into the rain-slick yard, his entire body a coiled spring. Then, crash. Glass shattered with a metallic chime ripping through the noise of the rain. Shards rained onto the kitchen floor. A figure in a dark jacket, hood pulled low, clambered through the broken window, water streaming from his clothes boots, grinding on the glass. Rocco struck like lightning. From the hall to the kitchen, his claws drummed a staccato beat on the wood before he launched himself, slamming into the intruder with the full weight of his body. The man went down hard, spine hitting the cold tile with a grunt. The growl that followed was deep and relentless, vibrating through the air. Rocco's jaws stopped inches from the man's throat, every muscle tensed to hold him down. The intruder writhed, trying to shove him off, but Rocco's forelegs pinned his shoulders with the grip of an iron vise. From the living room, Mason charged in. He took in the scene in a heartbeat. Rocco locked over the man, eyes blazing with resolve. "Hold him," Mason barked, then turned down the hall. Sarah was already descending the stairs, Leah wrapped tightly in a thick blanket in her arms. The child didn't understand, only seeing her protector locked in combat with a stranger, glass glinting everywhere. Mason guided them to the storage room at the hall's end, a reinforced space he used for valuables, and nodded. "In here, lock it. Don't open unless I call." Sarah stepped inside, eyes wide but steady. The door shut with a firm clack as the bolt slid home. Mason spun back to the kitchen. The intruder was still struggling, one hand, groping for the knife that had fallen in the scuffle. But Rocco was faster. pinning the man's wrist, pouring his weight down until the blade clattered away. The man's breath came in ragged gasps, rain and sweat streaming down his narrow hood-shadowed face. Mason ripped the hood back, revealing an unfamiliar visage, sharp, restless eyes scanning for escape. He kept him pinned while Rocco maintained his iron hold ear's rigid growl unwavering. Then, a noise from the back door. The sound of a lock turning. Mason's head snapped toward it, catching only the pounding of footsteps fading into the rain. There was a second man, and he was gone, retreating after seeing the break-in fail. In the kitchen, Rocco remained in position, eyes unblinking. Mason stepped forward, tying the intruder's hands with a length of paracord taken from a drawer. He pulled the man upright, pressing him against the wall before signaling Rocco to step back. But the dog stayed in front, ready to launch forward at the slightest movement. Outside, rain pounded the glass thunder and lightning tearing the night apart. Mason knew this was only the opening act of a long night, one in which even the smallest mistake could cost his family dearly. He looked at Rocco and nodded. "Good job, my friend." Rocco didn't answer. His breathing steadied, but his eyes still burned like two torches fixed on the shattered window where the darkness beyond concealed threats yet to show themselves. The sound of hurried footsteps rose from the backyard, cutting through the heavy rain. Mason caught a glimpse of a dark figure dashing across the porch water, splashing high with every stride. He shoved the tied intruder into a kitchen corner and sprinted toward the back door. It flew open, and wind and rain poured in like a freezing waterfall. Mason leapt down the steps, slipping briefly in the mud before regaining his balance. Ahead, the second intruder had already crossed the garden beds, his silhouette lurching under flashes of silver lightning shoes pounding the ground for speed. Behind, Rocco shot forward like an arrow loosed from a bow. Rain clung to his deep golden brown and sable fur, matting into strands, but it didn't slow him. His bark tore through the downpour, a clear warning to the fugitive that he was being hunted. Mason kept close, feeling his heartbeat pound in sync with the rain. The scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the cold air drifting from the lake sharpened his focus. The man glanced back, panic flashing in his eyes as Rocco closed in within meters. Suddenly, the intruder veered left, plunging into a narrow passage between two storage sheds. Mason changed course, boots splashing through a deep puddle, sending water to his knees. Rocco didn't slow, claws gripping the slick ground, shadowing his target without losing a step. A metallic crash rang out as the man slammed into an empty bin. He staggered, long enough for Rocco to close the gap. With a powerful leap, the German Shepherd's front paws hit his back, shoving him forward into the mud. Mason pounced, pinning the man's shoulders to block any resistance. Rocco stood upright beside him, breathing hard, eyes locked on their captive. Another flash of lightning lit a face Mason didn't recognize. Eyes fierce, yet edged with fear. "Who are you? Who sent you?" Mason demanded, his voice cutting through the storm. The man clenched his jaw, saying nothing, chest heaving. Mason knew he wouldn't get answers here in the freezing rain and sludge. He pulled the rope tight around the man's wrists. Rocco stayed close, ears high, gaze scanning the shadows. Together, man and dog glanced back toward the house, where a faint yellow glow spilled from an intact window. As Mason hauled the intruder upright, the man made one last lunge, but Rocco growled low and stepped forward, freezing him in place. Even muted by the storm, that growl carried a warning impossible to ignore. They trudged back along the garden path, mud clinging to clothes and fur. The prisoner tried jerking against the bindings a few times, but each attempt was met with Rocco's sharp bark, instantly quelling his resolve. The rain still hammered down, yet Mason could hear beyond it. Leah likely safe in the secure room. Sarah's footsteps coming down the stairs, and Rocco's steady, determined breathing beside him. Inside the porch, Mason handed the second man to Evan, who stood guard over the first. Rocco remained at the doorway, drenched, his eyes like glowing streaks in the night. Mason rested a hand on his shoulder. "Well done. This night isn't over yet." Outside, the storm seemed intent on erasing all traces. But Mason knew the enemy's footprints were still out there, and another wave was coming. The dim yellow from the garden's corner lamp spilled through the sheets of rain, casting blurred streaks on the mud. Mason had just locked the porch door when a sharp clatter came from the side fence. He spun around in time to see a masked figure vault over the wooden frame, landing in the backyard and bolting toward the rear garden. "Rocco," Mason shouted. In an instant, the German shepherd launched from the porch legs, churning through the slick earth, sending mud flying. Mason followed Rain, whipping his face the cold, erased by adrenaline. Window light flickered through the trees, creating a shifting maze of shadow and glow. The man's footsteps rang out through the storm, frantic, uneven. Rocco broke off to the side, curving to intercept. His soaked coat clung to the powerful frame beneath, muscles working in perfect rhythm. Every bound and push of his legs carried explosive force, as if the distance between him and the fugitive were no more than a blink. Mason kept pace as best he could, eyes fixed on the dark figure. The mud wanted to slow him, but Rocco's deep growl ahead kept him sharp, forbidding hesitation. The masked man cut into a narrow vegetable path, slipped, rolled hard, and sprang up again. That instant was all Rocco needed. He slammed forward full weight, driving the man off balance. A sharp cry escaped as both hit the ground. Mud splattered the air, thick with the scent of wet earth. Rocco braced both front paws across the man's chest, teeth clamping down on the heavy fabric of his sleeve, neutralizing every struggle. His eyes blazed hot breath, steaming in the freezing rain. Mason closed in, dropping to one knee, seizing the man's shoulder and wrenching him to reveal the face beneath the mask. In the dim light, Mason saw a thin, unfamiliar face, eyes fierce, but now edged with fear. "End of the line," Mason rasped, breath ragged from the chase. The man thrashed once more, but Rocco tightened his grip, ears high, body like a wall of steel, ready to crush resistance. Mason pulled the rope from his belt and bound the man's wrists firmly behind his back. The rain kept hammering down the dim porch light, swaying under the force of the wind, casting flickering beams across the scene. 3 silhouettes, 1 man, 1 dog, and 1 captured intruder, standing in the slick garden clothes and fur caked with mud. Yet in that moment, Mason knew they had just stopped another threat from getting anywhere near Leah and Sarah. He placed a hand on Rocco's back, feeling the warmth pulsing through the cold, rain-soaked fur. "Good job, Rocco. Let's go home." The German shepherd never took his eyes off the man they'd caught, only circling to Mason's side when the man was hauled to his feet and pushed forward Rocco's position, an unspoken warning that any thought of escape would end instantly. They made their way back, stepping over what used to be neat rows of plants, now churned into uneven pools of mud. The porch light grew closer, a small but steady beacon in the darkness and relentless downpour. Mason knew the night wasn't over yet. Danger still lingered somewhere out there in the shadows. The wail of sirens cut through the rain, tearing apart the garden's tense silence. White beams from police headlights swept back and forth across the trees, slicing bright shapes across wet earth and shimmering puddles. Mason gripped the prisoner's shoulder harder, feeling the man's ragged breathing before shoving him toward the gate. Rocco kept close at Mason's side, eyes sharp, tracking every twitch of the man's body. His amber gold coat, shaded with sable black, hung heavy with rain. Yet his stance remained tall, his stride powerful. When Mason reached the porch, the sweeping beam caught them full on. Through the veil of rain, dark uniformed figures took shape. They moved fast, water rolling off their hats and coats. One of them raised a hand. "Bring him here." Mason nodded, pushing the man toward them. A sergeant took over, cuffing him with swift, practiced motions before leading him to the cruiser. Moments later, 2 more officers escorted the first intruder, still bound, head down, raindrops splattering on the back of his neck. Radio chatter crackled through the downpour, short and clipped. The headlights swept the yard one last time, picking out the chaos of overlapping footprints in the mud. In the distance, a flash of lightning lit up a dark-colored van blocked at the end of the road. Likely the vehicle the group had used to get here. On the porch, Sarah clutched Leah close, both faces pale with shock. When the light brushed across them, Leah lifted a small hand toward Rocco. He trotted over, eyes softening, lowering his head so the little girl's hand could rest on him, a silent promise of safety. While the police secured the scene, Mason looked for Evan. He stood alone at the far edge of the porch, his shadow long against the light coat and hair dripping. The darkness hid most of his face, but Mason could see the eyes hiding a storm. Evan said nothing, only stared through the rain at the officers corralling the intruders. The downpour off the roof poured like a waterfall in front of him, a barrier between him and the rest of the world. A police officer stepped up to Mason, speaking quickly. "We'll take them in for questioning. Looks like they're part of a crew working around the lake. Thank you, and your dog, for stopping them." Mason's gaze slid to Rocco, his hand brushing from head to neck. "It was both of us." The patrol car's engine roared to life, red and blue lights strobing across the wet road. Headlights swept the yard one last time before the vehicle rolled away, swallowed by the curtain of rain. When the light faded, only the rain and Rocco's steady breathing remained. Mason turned toward Evan, ready to speak, but Evan stayed still, eyes far away. In the quiet between raindrops, Mason felt the distance, like Evan was standing miles away, even though he was only a few steps off. Deep down, Mason knew this wasn't the end. The attackers might be in custody, but there were still too many unanswered questions. And Evan's silent gaze was one of them. The rain softened, dripping rhythmically on the porch roof. Warm golden light spilled from the living room, touching the wet ground outside, in gentle contrast to the cold air. The cruisers were gone, their taillights faded to nothing in the mist. Mason closed the wooden door and leaned against it for a moment, catching his breath. Rocco lay on the rug, still watching the door as if guarding the threshold. Sarah and Leah had gone upstairs, but Mason's pulse hadn't eased. He looked at Evan, still standing in the corner of the porch, jacket dripping onto the tiles. "Evan, come inside," Mason said, his voice half invitation, half command. Evan stepped in his wet shoes, leaving faint, muddy prints on the floor. He didn't sit, just stood there, hands loosely clenched, eyes on the ground. Mason approached, sensing the weight pressing between them. "You want to tell me something?" Mason's tone was low but steady. Evan stayed silent for a few seconds before lifting his gaze. In those rain-bright eyes flickered something, regret and surrender tangled together. "At first, I was going to do it," his voice cracked every word in effort. "They wanted me to lead Leah outside, hand her over. In return, they'd let me go." Mason didn't speak, didn't look away. Evan swallowed hard and went on. "But when I saw Rocco standing in front of her, when he looked at me like that, I couldn't. It felt like someone crushed my chest. I realized this was the line I couldn't cross." His shoulders sagged. "I was wrong the moment I came back like this. I thought I could handle it, but I dragged all of you into danger. And I regret it, Mason." Mason searched his brother's face, finding not only guilt, but fear, exhaustion, and the faintest thread of hope. The past wouldn't erase easily. "Do you know that if Rocco hadn't been there?" Mason's voice sharpened for a heartbeat. "We might not be standing here right now." Evan lowered his head, fists tightening. Rocco rose, then stepping between them like a living bridge, his eyes meeting Mason's before flicking to Evan with a gentler look. Mason exhaled, stepping back. "I can't forgive you just like that. But you did stop." Outside, the rain kept falling, its steady patter softening the edges of what had just been said. Evan nodded slightly, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. But Mason knew the night hadn't closed the chapter. This truth was only the start of harder choices ahead. In the corner, Rocco lay down again, head resting on his paws, ears still tuned to the door. Even if the rain eased the darkness beyond, still hid things they couldn't yet see. The surface of Windmere Lake in the early morning was like a giant mirror, reflecting a sky slowly shifting from deep blue to soft bands of pink and pale orange. A thin veil of mist drifted across the water, curling into delicate ribbons before dissolving into the crisp air. From the trees along the shore came the lively chatter of sparrows mingling with the gentle rhythm of ripples brushing against the fine sand. After days of relentless investigation, the police had finally closed the case. The attackers were behind bars, and the gang operating around the lake had been dismantled almost entirely. Mason had received the news the night before, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though not completely. Evan had left town with a promise to start over somewhere far away, and Mason's family, Sarah and Leah, had begun to return to the rhythm of ordinary life. That morning, Leah woke earlier than usual. She pulled back the curtain, her eyes lighting up at the sight of sunlight spilling across the lake like molten gold. She hugged Rocco close, burying her face into his warm fur. "Let's go to the lake, Rocco," she whispered. Rocco tilted his head, ears perked tails swaying gently, as if he understood every word. Minutes later, the two were skipping down the narrow trail to the shore. From the porch, Mason and Sarah stood with steaming cups of coffee in hand, smiling at the sight. The morning breeze played with Leah's brown hair, lifting loose strands across her forehead. She laughed softly as she tossed a small piece of driftwood into the water. Rocco leapt in, sending glittering droplets into the air, then paddled back to shore with the stick held gently in his mouth, placing it into Leah's hand. His amber-brown eyes sparkled with pure joy, and Leah wrapped her arms around his neck, giggling. Mason walked over, kneeling beside his daughter and Rocco. He ran his hand slowly over the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. "You know," Mason said in a low, steady voice, "Rocco has saved us more times than you think." Leah nodded firmly, holding Rocco tighter. "I know. He's my best friend." From a short distance, Sarah captured the moment with her camera, her gaze glowing with quiet gratitude. The storm they had endured felt like it belonged to another life, and now the lake's sunrise carried a stillness they hadn't known in a long time. Rocco lifted his head, his gaze sweeping across the open water. His body was relaxed, yet there was an alertness in his eyes, a habit ingrained deep in his nature. But when Leah called his name, his focus shifted back to her. Instantly, his eyes softening in the golden light as his tail wagged with life. Their shadows stretched long across the sand, blending together in a warm silhouette. The sun rose higher, spilling warmth across the shore. Mason knew life would always bring unexpected trials, yet in moments like this, where family trust and love were undeniable, he felt certain they could weather anything. That evening, the last light of day washed Windmere in gold. Sunbeams slanted through the living room windows, painting long streaks across the polished wood floor. Mason sat in his familiar armchair, turning a cup of steaming tea in his hands, the faint scent of mint drifting upward. Sarah joined him quietly, placing her hand over his. For a while they sat in silence, letting the rare calm settle between them after so many tense days. Rocco lay on the floor beside them, his head resting on Leah's legs, the steadfast shadow of the family. Mason spoke first. "How do you feel, Sarah?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes held a faraway look. "Lighter. But I still think about everything that happened. It's like a scar, Mason. It will heal, but it will never disappear." Mason nodded, his gaze drifting toward the shimmering lake beyond the window. "I think so too. Maybe scars are reminders of what matters most and of the people who stood beside us when we needed them. Sarah's hand tightened over his, her eyes falling to a brown envelope on the table. "Have you read Evan's letter?" Mason hesitated, then picked it up, sliding out a slightly crumpled sheet. Evan's handwriting was familiar, shaky yet deliberate. "Mason, by the time you read this, I've probably already left Windmere. I couldn't face you and Sarah again, but I need you to know. I've never stopped thinking of your family as my home. I made the worst mistake of my life when I let myself fall into that path. But in that moment when Rocco stood in front of Leah, I finally saw what I'd been blind to all these years. Love and protection without condition. I'm sorry. And I hope that one day when I'm a better man, I can come back, worthy of being here. Evan." Mason folded the letter, sliding it back into its envelope, his palm resting on it as though holding something fragile. He met Sarah's eyes, slow but steady. "I don't know if that day will come, but I want to believe Evan will find his way." Sarah nodded softly, and together they turned toward the lake where Leah was still laughing with Rocco. Her voice mingled with the sound of wind and water, a reminder that even where the past had left its marks, hope could grow in the very same soil. Outside, the sun dipped lower, setting the sky aflame with shades of orange and red, its reflection shimmering across the lake. In that light, Mason felt certain, though the road ahead was still unknown, their family had built something unshakable, rooted in love, trust, and sacrifice. Late afternoon in Windmere carried a gentle light, like a pale golden veil draped over every rooftop and tree. A breeze came in from the lake, laced with the damp scent of late autumn leaves and the faint sweetness of freshly cut grass. On the wooden porch, Rocco lay on his side, his warm golden-brown coat glowing in the fading sun, ears pricked amber eyes fixed on the gravel path leading to the house. The path was as quiet as always, with only a few dry leaves tumbling in lazy spirals to the ground. But to Rocco, every rustle, every passing shadow was worth noting. He wasn't tense yet. There was a steady watchfulness in his gaze, the instinct of a guardian that time could not erode. Inside, Mason had just finished his day's work. He stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, the steam curling into the cool air. Sitting down beside Rocco, his fingers slipped into the thick fur at the dog's neck, a touch that felt as natural as breathing. Mason bent closer, his voice low. "We're still here, Rocco." The dog turned his head, eyes meeting Mason's. In that brief moment, there was an answer without words. A quiet promise, unwavering and sure, that whatever tomorrow held, they would face it together. From the yard, Leah laughed brightly as she chased the paper kite Mason had crafted just for her. Sarah stood on the porch steps, her gaze following her daughter with a soft smile, while the day's last sunlight poured over her face in a warm golden glow. Peaceful days had returned, yet everyone understood that life could always carry unexpected trials. In the distance, the road leading to the lake seemed to connect the town to untold stories. Mason drew in a deep breath, tasting the wind laced with the scent of damp earth and maple leaves. He knew there would be quiet days like this one, and there would be days when storms rolled in without warning. But when he looked down and saw Rocco lying steadily on the porch, he understood that this family had a tireless gatekeeper. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in wide ribbons of rose and violet. From the lake came the gentle lapping of waves against the shore like a soft soundtrack to the passing afternoon. Mason rose, giving Rocco a light pat on the shoulder before stepping inside. The German shepherd stayed in place, eyes fixed on the long road ahead, as though no matter how vast the world outside might be, it would have to pass through this gaze before reaching Mason's family. And at that crossroad between peace and uncertainty, Rocco remained an irreplaceable figure, a silent sentinel, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. The story of Mason, Sarah, Leah, and the German shepherd, named Rocco, closed beneath the gentle gold of a late autumn evening. yet its echo lingered like a warm, low melody in the heart of the reader. Rocco was not just a dog, but a symbol of loyalty, courage, and unconditional love, qualities for which the German Shepherd breed has long been cherished around the world. From serene mornings by the lake to tense moments facing danger, Rocco had always stood at the front line to protect his family. His presence was proof that love and trust need no words, only the steady actions and unbreakable bonds that speak for themselves. The story reminds us that when we give our love and respect to another living being, we receive far more in return. Not just loyalty, but a source of strength to endure life's trials. With their intelligence, bravery, and gentle hearts, German Shepherds have become irreplaceable companions for countless families on countless journeys. Behind every moving story about a dog lies a reminder of how we should live, knowing how to cherish, how to protect, and how to love. And just like Rocco, there will always be silent gatekeepers in our lives, ready to stand beside us no matter what road lies ahead.